Story number 1. I never thought something as simple as driving on the highway could change my life in a matter of seconds. I mean, I've always been a cautious driver, hands at 10 and 2, speed under control, always scanning the road ahead. But no amount of preparation can protect you from other people's stupidity. It was a typical weekday morning. I was on my way to work, cruising along at a steady pace. Traffic wasn't too bad, which was a small miracle. The weather was clear, visibility perfect. I was in the right lane, minding my own business, when it happened. A car in front of me swerved out of nowhere, no signal, no warning, just a sharp veer into the next lane. My first thought was that the driver must have been distracted, but then I saw it. A brick. Just a single rogue brick, lying in the middle of the highway like some sick joke. I didn't have time to react, not really. I couldn't swerve left. There was a car right next to me, and swerving right? No chance. It would have sent me into the guardrail. My only option was to hold the wheel steady and hope for the best. The second my front tire hit the brick, I knew I was in trouble. The impact was so violent, it felt like the whole car lifted off the ground for a split second. My tire blew instantly, and I lost control of the steering. My car veered sharply to the right, skidding toward the shoulder. I tried to correct it, but at that speed, it was like trying to steer a boat in a hurricane. Everything happened so fast, yet somehow, it felt like slow motion. The guardrail was coming up fast, but that wasn't the worst of it. As I fought to regain control, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a semi-truck barreling down on me. It must have been going 65 or 70, and there was no way it could stop in time. My heart was in my throat. I didn't have time to think, only to react. I jerked the wheel hard, managing to swing the car just enough to avoid slamming into the guardrail head-on. My car spun out, tires screeching as the semi thundered past, missing me by what felt like inches. My car came to a stop on the shoulder, the front end facing the wrong direction. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, my whole body shaking. I could still hear the sound of the truck's horn blaring, the whoosh of wind as it flew by, and the sickening thud of that damn brick hitting my tire. It all replayed in my head, over and over. I was lucky. Lucky that I didn't get hit by that truck. Lucky that my car didn't flip or smash into the guardrail. But that brick? It was such a small thing. A single stupid brick lying in the road, and it almost killed me. I never realized how quickly something so mundane could turn deadly. You think of highway dangers as big things, speeding, reckless drivers, bad weather, but sometimes it's the little things you don't expect that can change everything in a split second. Since that day, I've become hyper-aware when I drive, constantly scanning the road for any sign of debris. I keep a firm grip on the wheel, ready to react at a moment's notice, because I know now how fragile that sense of control really is. It only takes one small object, one split second of bad luck, and everything can go horribly wrong. That brick wasn't supposed to be there, but it was, and it almost cost me my life. Story number 2. It's funny how a seemingly normal day can turn deadly in the blink of an eye. I always thought I was careful, kept my wits about me, paid attention to my surroundings. But that day, I learned how fast things can spiral out of control, and how something as simple as water can become a killer. It was supposed to be a fun day on the lake. My friends and I had rented a cabin near the shore for a weekend getaway, barbecuing, swimming, kayaking, the works. The sun was shining, the water looked calm, and everything seemed perfect. It was exactly what we needed after months of stress from work. I've always been a strong swimmer. Grew up near the water, spent summers at the pool or by the beach, so I never had much fear when it came to being in the lake. That morning, we all decided to take the kayaks out for a spin, just paddling around, enjoying the quiet. After about an hour, the wind started picking up. Nothing crazy at first, just a few gusts here and there. But then, out of nowhere, the water went from calm to choppy. I remember thinking it was weird how quickly the lake had changed, but I wasn't worried. I figured we'd just paddle back to shore and call it a day. Except it wasn't that simple. The wind kept getting stronger, and before we knew it, the waves were tossing the kayaks around like toys. I could barely keep mine steady, and every time I tried to paddle forward, the current pushed me back. It was like the lake had turned against us. That's when things went south. One of the guys, Brian, lost control of his kayak. A wave slammed into him, flipping his kayak over. He was thrown into the water, and for a second, I didn't even see him resurface. Panic set in as I paddled toward him, but the wind and waves were making it almost impossible to get close. I finally spotted him. He was struggling, trying to flip his kayak back over, but the waves kept battering him. I paddled as hard as I could, my arms burning from the effort, but no matter how close I got, it felt like the current was pulling me away from him. He was starting to panic, and the more he struggled, the worse it got. "Brian," I shouted, trying to get his attention. "Stop fighting the water. Float on your back." He didn't hear me. The wind was too loud, the waves too strong. I was still about 10 feet away when I saw him go under again. This time, he didn't come up. I abandoned my kayak and dove into the water. The shock of the cold hit me immediately, but I pushed through it, swimming as hard as I could. When I reached the spot where I'd last seen Brian, I dove down, my heart racing. The water was murky, and I couldn't see a thing. My lungs burned as I searched frantically, my hands grasping at nothing. Finally, I felt something, his arm. I grabbed hold of him and kicked toward the surface, pulling him up with me. When we broke through the water, he was gasping, choking, but alive. I dragged him back to my kayak and held on to both of us, trying to keep our heads above water as the waves continued to crash around us. Eventually, the others reached us and helped drag Brian to shore. By the time we got him back onto land, he was coughing and shivering, but he was okay. We were all shaken, exhausted, but alive. I've never been more terrified in my life. Water, something I'd always felt so comfortable in, had almost taken my friend in seconds. The lake went from calm to chaos in the blink of an eye, and if I hadn't reached him when I did, he wouldn't have made it. I still think about that day, how quickly everything can change, how even the strongest swimmer can be helpless against the power of moving water. It's easy to underestimate water, to think it's something we can control, but the truth is, we're at its mercy. One minute, you're having the time of your life, and the next, you're fighting to stay alive. I'll never take that for granted again. Story number 3. I never gave much thought to the heavy machinery at my dad's workshop. To me, it was just part of the background. Wrenches, engines, tools. All those big, dangerous-looking things were just part of his world, not mine. But one afternoon, all of that changed in the most terrifying way possible. My dad owns a small auto repair shop, and I used to help him out on weekends. I wasn't much of a mechanic, but I'd sweep the floors, organize tools, sometimes hold a flashlight while he worked on an engine. Nothing too complicated. But that day, it was busier than usual, and one of his regular guys had called in sick, so I decided to step up and help out more than I normally would. We were in the back of the shop, working on a customer's car that had a busted transmission. There was a lot of tension in the room, time pressure, the job wasn't going smoothly, and my dad was stressed. He needed to get the job done by the end of the day. I was standing by the hydraulic lift, holding a few tools for him, when he asked me to grab something from the other side of the shop. As I walked away, I heard a sharp snap, the kind of sound that makes your heart jump into your throat. I spun around, and what I saw next still haunts me. The hydraulic lift cable had snapped. The entire weight of the car, suspended above my dad, came crashing down in an instant. It was a blur. 1 second, the car was in the air, and the next, it was slamming down toward the ground. I barely had time to process what was happening, let alone scream. But somehow, in that split second, my dad dove out of the way. He rolled to the side, his body just missing the massive hunk of metal by inches. The car hit the floor with a deafening crash, the sound of metal on concrete reverberating through the shop. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My legs felt like jelly, and I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at where my dad had been working moments before. He lay on the ground, covered in grease and dust, breathing heavily but alive. I ran over to him, my hands shaking, and helped him sit up. He had a few scrapes, and his shirt was torn, but he was okay. It felt like a miracle. A few seconds later, and the car would have crushed him. I'll never forget the look on his face when he finally stood up. He was shaken, pale, and I could see the fear in his eyes. My dad, the guy who'd always been this unshakable force, was rattled to his core. We didn't say much, just stood there for a minute, staring at the wreckage. We learned later that the cable had been worn down over time, weakened by rust and stress. We'd never noticed it, never thought to check it more closely. That's the thing about these machines. You think they're indestructible until they're not. After that day, everything changed. We were more careful, triple checking equipment, inspecting cables, never taking shortcuts. But it stuck with me. The idea that something as simple as a cable, something you'd never even think twice about, could almost kill someone in the blink of an eye. People don't realize how dangerous things under tension can be. Whether it's a hydraulic lift or a garage door spring, all it takes is one snap, 1 second, and everything changes. I think about that every time I step into the shop now. I don't take anything for granted anymore. That cable could have killed my dad, and it would have been over before I could even scream. Story number 4. I've always been a bit of a thrill seeker. Skydiving, bungee jumping, cliff diving, you name it, I've probably done it. I'm the guy who's always looking for the next adrenaline rush. But after what happened last year, I've learned that the real danger isn't always in the extreme. It's in the things you never see coming. It was supposed to be a quick hike, nothing crazy, just a trail I'd been on 100 times before. My friend Jake and I had planned to hit the trail early, get some miles in, and be back home before noon. The weather was perfect, cool breeze, sunny skies, and the trail was dry. It was the kind of day that makes you feel invincible, like nothing bad could possibly happen. We were about halfway through the hike, on a part of the trail that snaked around a steep cliffside. It wasn't particularly dangerous, but there were spots where the path narrowed, and you had to be careful where you stepped. I'd been on this trail so many times though, I could practically walk it with my eyes closed. As we rounded a bend, Jake spotted something off the trail, an old rock formation. He wanted to check it out, maybe climb to the top for a better view. I wasn't so sure. The formation looked unstable, like it had been worn down by years of wind and rain, but Jake was insistent. He started scrambling up the rocks before I could say anything. I stood at the bottom, watching him climb, a nagging feeling tugging at the back of my mind. Something about the rocks looked wrong. They were jagged and loose, shifting under Jake's weight as he made his way up. But he was halfway to the top by then, and I didn't want to be the guy who ruined the fun. So, I stayed quiet and watched. He was almost at the top when it happened. I heard the crack before I saw it. A deep, rumbling sound like the earth itself was splitting open. I looked up just in time to see the rocks under Jake's feet give way. The whole formation shifted, and suddenly, Jake was free-falling. He landed hard, about 10 feet from where I stood. The impact was sickening. I ran over to him, my heart racing, expecting the worst. He was conscious but groaning, clutching his leg. When I looked down, I saw why. His leg was bent at a horrifying angle, bone pushing against the skin, threatening to break through. He was pale, his face contorted in pain. I knew we had to get him help, fast, but we were miles from the trailhead, and there was no cell service out here. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told Jake to hang on, that I'd figure something out, but inside, I was freaking out. He couldn't move, and if I didn't act quickly, the situation could get a lot worse. I ended up having to leave him there. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I had no choice. I ran back down the trail as fast as I could, my lungs burning, every second feeling like an eternity. When I finally got close enough to get a signal, I called 911 and gave them our location. I remember pacing, hands shaking, waiting for the rescue team to arrive, praying they'd get there in time. When they finally did, they told me how lucky we were. Jake's leg was shattered, but he hadn't hit his head, and there was no internal bleeding. If he had fallen just a little further, or if I hadn't gotten help when I did, the story could have ended very differently. It wasn't the thrill-seeking that almost killed him. It was a simple, stupid mistake. Stepping on loose rocks without thinking, underestimating the danger of something that seems so harmless. I've climbed higher, done crazier things, but that was the day I realized how fragile life can be. Now, when I hike, I'm careful. I watch where I step, double-check my surroundings, and I don't take unnecessary risks. Not because I'm scared of danger, but because I've learned that it's the small, overlooked things that can catch you off guard. The things that kill you in seconds aren't always the ones you see coming. Sometimes they're right under your feet. Story number 5. You wouldn't think a quiet night in your own home could turn deadly, but it can. I learned that the hard way last winter, and it still makes my skin crawl to think about how close I came to not waking up at all. It was one of those brutally cold nights in January, the kind where the air is so cold it feels like it's biting you, and everything outside is frozen solid. My furnace had been acting up for a few days, so I wasn't taking any chances. I bought a portable space heater to use in my bedroom to keep warm through the night. Seemed like a simple enough solution, right? I'd always been careful with things like that. I made sure to keep the heater away from anything flammable, double-checked that the cords were in good shape, and set it to a moderate temperature. Nothing too hot, nothing that would overwork the thing. I figured it was safe. I'd used space heaters before without any issues. That night, I fell asleep easily, the soft hum of the heater in the background and the warmth wrapping around me like a blanket. I didn't have a care in the world, just happy to be warm in the middle of a freezing night. But at some point in the early hours of the morning, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I felt off. groggy, but not in the usual way. It wasn't the kind of tired where you want to roll over and go back to sleep. It was heavy, like I couldn't quite shake the fog from my brain. My head was pounding, and there was this weird taste in my mouth, almost metallic. I tried to sit up, but it was like my body didn't want to cooperate. Then, I smelled it. It wasn't smoke, not exactly. It was more like a faint, burning odor, like something was smoldering but hadn't quite caught fire. My heart started racing. I looked over at the space heater, and that's when I saw it. Sparks. Tiny sparks were flickering out of the bottom, and there was a small, dark burn mark on the carpet beneath it. I jumped out of bed so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My legs felt like jelly, and my head was swimming, but the adrenaline kicked in hard. I yanked the plug out of the wall and dragged the heater into the bathroom, dumping it into the bathtub before it could do any more damage. The whole room smelled like burning plastic, and my throat was scratchy, like I'd been breathing in something toxic for hours. I opened all the windows, even though it was freezing outside, and just sat on the edge of the tub, shaking. My head was still spinning, and I realized I'd been this close, to something way worse than a burn mark on the carpet. The heater had shorted out, overheated, most likely, and nearly caught fire while I was asleep. But the worst part? It wasn't just the fire hazard, it was the carbon monoxide. That weird, heavy feeling I'd had when I woke up? That wasn't just exhaustion, it was carbon monoxide poisoning. The heater had been slowly filling my room with the gas for hours, and if I hadn't woken up when I did, if my body hadn't screamed for air, I probably wouldn't have woken up at all. I didn't even have a carbon monoxide detector in my room. I'd never thought I needed one, not with something as simple as a space heater. But that night, I learned the hard way that anything that burns fuel, anything that generates heat, can also generate carbon monoxide. It's silent, it's deadly, and it'll kill you in your sleep without you ever knowing. The next morning, I went out and bought 2 carbon monoxide detectors, one for my bedroom, one for the hallway. I don't take chances anymore. That gas is invisible, odorless, and it'll take your life without a second thought. I think about that night sometimes, about how close I came to not being here, how easily it could have ended with just one tiny mistake, one piece of equipment malfunctioning while I slept, completely unaware. Now every time I turn on a heater, every time I use anything that could produce gas, I'm careful, maybe too careful, but I'd rather be paranoid than dead. You don't realize how dangerous something as simple as heat can be until it almost kills you. Story number 6. I've always been a dog person. Growing up, we had a big German Shepherd named Duke, who was practically my shadow. Loyal, protective, and gentle as could be. So, when I finally got my own place a few years ago, the first thing I did was adopt a dog. This time, I went for something a little different, a pit bull mix named Charlie. I'd heard all the nonsense about how dangerous pit bulls could be, but I didn't believe a word of it. It's all about how you raise them, right? And Charlie was a sweetheart. He was goofy, always wagging his tail, and he loved everyone. The mailman, the neighbors, strangers at the park. He was just a big baby. So, when my cousin Jen asked if I could dog sit her little chihuahua, Bella, for the weekend, I didn't think twice about it. Charlie had been around small dogs before and never had an issue. What could go wrong? Jen dropped off Bella on a Friday evening, and everything seemed fine. Charlie was curious, sniffing her all over, but Bella wasn't too interested. She was one of those yappy, high-strung little dogs who acted like she owned the place the second she walked in. Typical Chihuahua attitude. The first night went smoothly, and I figured it was going to be an easy weekend. Saturday morning, I decided to take both dogs to the park. Charlie loved running off leash, and Bella could get some exercise too. I'd brought them out together, both leashed, and everything seemed fine at first. But when we got back home, something changed. It started with Bella. She was barking non-stop, pacing around like she was on edge. Maybe she was just anxious being in a new place. But Charlie was acting weird too. He was staring at her, his ears back, and something about the way he was watching her put me on edge. I brushed it off. Dogs have moods just like we do, but that gut feeling stayed with me. And then it happened. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a low growl. Not the playful kind either. This was deep, from Charlie's chest. I looked up just in time to see Bella dart across the room toward his food bowl, like she owned the place. I didn't think much of it. Charlie had never been food aggressive, but the second she got close, Charlie lunged. I didn't have time to react. 1 second, Bella was yapping away, and the next, Charlie had her in his jaws, shaking her like a rag doll. The sound of Bella's screams ripped through me, and I jumped off the couch, panicked, shouting Charlie's name, trying to pull him off. But he wasn't listening. He was in full predator mode, teeth locked around Bella's tiny body, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I grabbed a broom and managed to wedge it between them, pushing Charlie back just enough to get him to drop her. Bella hit the floor, limp and silent. My heart was pounding as I scooped her up, my hands shaking. She was still breathing, but barely. Her little body was torn up, bleeding, and I didn't know if she was going to make it. I rushed her to the emergency vet, tears in my eyes the whole way, blaming myself for not stopping it sooner, for not seeing the warning signs. They managed to save Bella, but just barely. She spent 2 days in intensive care, and even when she pulled through, she was never quite the same. I'd always heard that dogs, especially certain breeds, could flip in a second, but I never believed it, until that day. Charlie had never shown any signs of aggression before, but in the blink of an eye, instinct took over, and he became a completely different animal. I thought I knew my dog, thought I could trust him with anything, but I was wrong. After the attack, I had to make a difficult decision. Charlie was still my dog, and I loved him, but I couldn't ignore what had happened. I couldn't risk it happening again, to another dog or, God forbid, a person. So, I rehomed him to a family with no other pets, somewhere out in the country where he could run and be free without any risks. I still think about him, about what triggered that split-second attack. Was it Bella's attitude? Was it something in Charlie that had always been there, waiting to surface? I'll never know for sure, but what I do know is that even the sweetest, most well-trained dog can turn in an instant. It's something you never expect until it's too late. You always hear that it's not the breed, it's the owner. But the truth is, with animals, you never fully know, and in 1 second, a situation can go from peaceful to deadly.